This past Wednesday, after postponing it and postponing it and postponing it, I finally went to jury duty. I figured I had to do it sooner or later. And you know how you go to this big room and there are lots of people there and everyone's looking at their phones or doing whatever they're doing and they're throwing a lot of information at you and you kind of tune out, which I did. You know, I perked up once in a while when I was like, okay, I have to pay attention to that instruction. But then they showed us this video that was really interesting about unconscious bias. And at some point, the narrator of this video showed us this figure, and she said, "How many triangles do you see?" So of course, I saw 2 overlapping triangles with 6 points, and it was a Jewish star. And I figured everyone else was seeing that too, but it turned out they weren't. Some people saw two triangles, 3 triangles, 4 triangles, up to 13 triangles. And it turned out, the narrator said, that there actually wasn't even 1 triangle. And why was that? Because the lines that made up the triangles were broken. And what our minds do when we see a pattern that's kind of familiar, we don't pay attention to the details, and we decide that that's the thing we think it is. That's a triangle. That's a Jewish star. So when I was sent to room 218, of course, I thought it was double chai. I'm not kidding, it was really 218. And it was double chai because I was actually released from jury duty after 1 day. And I was so happy because I had a big deadline. But our brains do fill in gaps, right? They fill in gaps all the time. We've got images inside our brain, and we look at the world and we say, oh, that's that, even if it might not be that. I know that was clear. So let me give an example. So the narrator said that, let's say someone's late, and researchers have found that if that person is of a certain gender, let's say, then they're let off the hook. Oh, they must have run into traffic. But if they're a different gender or sexual orientation or ethnicity or skin color, then, oh, that person has a time management problem, right? Something else kicks in. And what we were asked to do as jurors, I was never actually impaneled, was imagine that the person that we're judging or deciding if they're guilty, liable, whatever the case might be, imagine that they're a different gender or ethnicity or nationality, and then see if you think the same thing about them. So we're always connecting dots, right? We're always drawing lines, and the lines are not necessarily there. Now, you might be wondering, how does that relate to the portion? And I'll tell you. The most famous story in this portion is Akedat Yitzchak. It's the binding of Isaac. And it seems like one story. It seems seamless. When you read it through, oh, God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son, and then God seems to have changed God's mind. But if you look at it carefully, what you find are really 2 very distinct texts. And what explains these 2 very distinct texts, which I'll explain to you in a few minutes, is something called the documentary hypothesis. Now, how many of you have heard about that? Great, so a lot of you haven't. Now, I have to say that when I was in rabbinical school, as soon as I heard those words, I tuned out. So I know a little bit about it, not a lot about it, and what I'm interested in is literary interpretation. So when it helps me with literary interpretation, I cue into this idea. So according to the documentary hypothesis, there are actually 5, not authors, but like schools of authorship, J, E, P, and D. Who am I missing? J, E, D, P, so I'm sorry, J, E, P, and D, so 4 schools. And the redactor of the Torah kind of weaves these pieces together. So different schools of thought create different literature that makes it eventually into the Torah. And it's almost like, imagine quilt squares, and someone sort of stitching the squares together. Or many redactors, actually. There's lots of redactors. Okay, I'm sure someone here knows a lot more about this than I do, but I hope that was clear enough. Yeah, okay, great. So the Akedah. So at the start of the story, the name of God that appears is Ha-Elohim, right? So that means to us that the Elohist school is behind it. And let me read you the first verse. V'Elohim nisa et Avraham, v'yomer elav Avraham, v'yomer hineni. And Elohim tests Abraham and says to him, Abraham, and Abraham says, here I am. And what does this Elohim tell Abraham to do? To sacrifice his only son, even though there's another son, the son that he loves, right? To sacrifice Isaac. So what a horrifying God this is. But in the first half of the story, Elohim, that name of God, appears 4 or 5 times, not any other name of God. And then the Elohim, the Elohist text takes us to this point. Abraham takes Isaac, puts him on the altar on top of the wood that Isaac has been carrying, stretches out his hand to slay his son, and suddenly the text shifts completely. It's as if we're reading a different story. Imagine yourself driving on a country road, heading towards the mountains, and suddenly, out of nowhere, you make a sharp left turn, your wheels are screeching, and you head instead to the ocean, right? And scholars say that the Elohist text actually ends up, even though it's not in the text directly, with Isaac being sacrificed, being killed entirely. So the Yahwist comes in, and suddenly we hear something else entirely. An angel of God, a Malach Adonai, which is the point, because now we're in the Yahwist text, calls from the heavens, Vayikra elav Malach Adonai min hashamayim vayomer, and says, Avraham, Avraham, Abraham, Abraham, vayomer hineni, here I am. And what does the angel tell him? Al tishlach yadcha el hana'ar. Don't stretch out your hand against the boy. Thank God, otherwise we wouldn't have a story at all. Ve'al ta'as lomu me'uma. Don't do anything to him. Ki ata yadati, because I now know, ki yarei Elohim ata, because you stand in fear or in awe of Elohim. So somehow, this text here, but not before, integrates 2 names of God. The Yahwist, right? First the Elohist, the Elohim, and now the Yud He Vav He, now Adonai. V'lo chasachta et bincha et yichicha mimeni. And you didn't withhold. So God now knows, Elohim now knows, that you didn't withhold your child from me. So again, we only have Elohim, Elohim, Elohim in the first half of the text. And the second half of the text, the angel of Yud He Vav He, right, of Yahweh, steps in and then brings in, even though it's the Yahwist, brings in the name of God, which is Elohim. So there's some kind of integration here. And that integration is what saves Isaac, right? So how does this work? So if you think about Elohim, the name of God, which is Elohim, means strict justice. And in fact, God says in the Talmud, right, there's a quote of God that says, if I create the world with strict judgment alone, how could the world endure? It would shatter from the harshness of justice. So Din, right, strict justice, which represents Elohim, or Elohim represents strict justice, is the God before whom we cannot endure because there is no rachamim. There's no forgiveness, there's no give, there's no flexibility. But if you ever sort of encounter someone that judges you so harshly, right, without forgiveness, and you feel you can't exist before their eyes. So the Torah here does something so brilliant, right? Moving from Elohim to Yud He Vav He, right? The Elohist to the Yahweh, but then bringing Elohim back in. So we have a measure of Din, we have a measure of justice, and a nice measure of Rachamim. And the Rachamim, again, is what saves Isaac's life. So I think, as I said before, some scholars say in the Elohist version, Isaac dies, right? Isaac doesn't survive at all. And what's interesting is that when Abraham goes back to his servants, he goes back alone. Isaac is missing from the text, and Isaac is missing from the text for 3 whole chapters after this, right? So there is some kind of strand here which points towards Isaac's complete disappearance or death. And some say, some of the rabbis say, some of the midrash say, he actually died, went to heaven for 3 years, 3 chapters, 3 years, and then was resurrected. And he's resurrected when? When Rebecca comes on the scene, right? In the context of relationship, in the context of a loving other who might help resurrect him from trauma. So what does this have to do with us and with now? I feel overwhelmingly that we live in a world that is split, that is fractured, that is full of harsh judgment. And I wonder if we can sort of use the Torah as a model, use this tapestry to sort of check the way we're splitting the world into 2. And I'm not saying that there aren't real enemies out there, or actually this is what I'm saying. We have to fight for the world we believe in and try, maybe with a small dose of rachamim, to humanize who we think are our enemies. I don't know if that's possible, but to keep the world human, I think we have to do that. To endure and to have our children and our children's children endure, I think we need a dose of rachamim because the world can't exist just with strict justice. So this morning I ran into some friends of mine. We were walking dogs, and one friend said, yeah, my husband gets up, and instead of a practice of gratitude, is a practice of rage and fury, right? It's like talking about the news is a practice of rage and fury. So I'm wondering how we might bring, again, a little bit of rachamim to the world. And I often think about God's prayer for God's self in the Talmud, which I absolutely love. And God says, Yehi ratzon milfanai sheyichbishu rachamai et ka'asi. May it be my will that my mercy will overcome my anger. God's praying to God's self because it's so hard, even for God, to have God's compassion overcome God's anger, right? The practice of rage and fury is more tempting to us, I think, than the practice of gratitude and compassion. And then God goes on, Vayigolu rachamai, rachamai al midotai, ve'etnaheg im banai, b'midat rachamim. And may my mercy prevail over my other attributes, and may I conduct myself toward my children with the attribute of mercy. So I bless all of us that this should be our prayer for ourselves, and we should repeat it again and again like a mantra, so that we live in a world where not only the people on our side are human, but even the world where the people across the divide are also human, as we fight for the world that should be.